right, good people. Hello there, and welcome back. So per usual, we are continuing in our series, Fervent. We are over halfway there, folks. Um, this week we are on strategy 7, which talks about purity, and that is a really good one. Lots of great stuff to talk about with that one. So here's where we are. Hopefully you can see that there. So we are going to once again dive right in. So I thought that it'd be good to start out with just looking at a couple scriptures that sort of set the tone for what Priscilla Shire is talking about in these passages. So first is 1 Peter 5, chapter 8. And it says, "Stay alert, watch out for your great enemy, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." So when we talk about our purity, just in the context of temptations, just keeping in mind that like we do have an enemy who is looking for ways to take us out. So that one, and then the second scripture is Luke 4, 13. And this verse is coming right off the heels of Jesus being tempted by Satan after fasting. So right before his ministry started. And it says, when the devil had finished tempting him, he left him until the next opportunity came. And so another scripture that basically supports the fact that like Satan is very active in his strategies and kind of how he's going after us. So all things to keep in mind, that like these things that we're going to talk about don't happen by coincidence. So when I think of purity, I think of simply just being free from sin. Anything that would be considered sin is impure. So purity is trying to avoid all of those things. There are some things that are like clear and explicit in the Bible, and then there are other things that may be sin for you based on your conscience, that you stay away from, that may not be sin for me, or vice versa. So she started out saying that if I were your enemy, I would tempt you toward certain sins. I would study you so I know the precise conditions to make you most likely to indulge. And she started off with a banger, right? Because that just immediately, along with those Bible verses that I read, just kind of put it in perspective that like, if we have an enemy out there, which Satan is, like he ain't coming to play, okay? He's studying you, studying me to know exactly what ways to tempt us, knowing exactly what conditions to strike in, what conditions make us more susceptible and more vulnerable. So I thought about things like stress eating, or if you know something like tips you over the edge. He's looking for those types of things like, oh, when I get stressed, then I'm tempted to eat more unhealthy, or whatever the knack may be for you. But he's looking like, oh, she's stressed, insert chocolate, you know. But of course, like that's a very minor example, but his is upscale by far. And so why even the topic, right, of purity? Why is that even important? And it's because sin separates us from God. And it's interesting because I think we can indulge in behaviors, sinful behaviors that separate us from God, and then question why we feel distant from God, you know. And it's like there's a moral compass here for a reason. And so she listed some examples of impurity, like moral compromise, unhealthy habits, enticing addictions, sexual impurity. And I spiked out enticing addictions and sexual impurity specifically because I feel like those are like easily identified, right? Like when you think about impurities, addictions or sexual impurity are kind of like, yeah, get that. You know, those are things top of mind. Moral compromises and unhealthy habits are not necessarily top of mind. And I know for me, what I've seen be true is that, the longer that I am a Christian, the less that it's about the outward sins for me and more about the sins of the heart. So I don't necessarily struggle as much with the things that you can outwardly see are sinful. Like, I left sex before marriage in my past life. I left drunkenness in my past life. A lot of those like super outward things aren't, I don't anticipate, and Satan knows that that's not my struggle. So that's what he doesn't tempt me with that. But for me, like emotional connection, it'll take me out, and so he knows that about me. And so I can feel more tempted in that way, which doesn't sound as bad, but for me it's sin, and so it separates from God. So taking a deeper dive to think about what are the compromises to my conscience that I can indulge in, even if it's not the big stuff. And I also think about how I read that passage about, it said that Satan was leaving until the next opportunity came. But when he tempted Jesus, it was right when Jesus was coming out the wilderness, had been praying for 40 days and 40 nights. So he was in a weakened state. So keeping that in mind, that like there's no reason to tempt you when you're doing great. Okay, Satan is more crafty than that. Like when you're super strong, doing well spiritually, like that's usually not when he's trying to creep up behind you, sis. So keeping that in mind as well, that when you're in a fragile state for any reason, you're going to be more susceptible and more prone to being tempted and more prone to falling prey during that time. So think about it from a very strategic perspective and ask yourself, what has Satan picked out just for you? What is it that he knows about you, that he knows just when to present something at the right time? Mine is going to be different from yours. Like I said, something that's sin for me may be different for you, because there may be something that's on my conscience that may not prick your conscience. The Bible talks about, one person may choose to eat one thing, another person may not. Let it all be for the glory of God, whatever you're doing from a conscience perspective. She also had a really good point in here about remember the last time that you indulged. Remember that former way of life. And that's always a great reminder for me, because when I can be tempted to go back to my former way of life, or this walk is hard and I'm like, is it really worth resisting and continuing to fight? I remember that like my former life was so empty. Like I would have nights that, made me feel fulfilled in that moment, but then the next day I gotta face reality again. And so going back to realize and remember and reflect on, like, there were a lot of empty days, in my former life, because the things that I was trying to fill myself with were not truly fulfilling, because they weren't what God had for me. And so the same with these different temptations, that while it may seem enticing at the moment, remember that former way of life and where it left you. And also remember that though you may be forgiven of those sins, they still have consequences. And that's a really hard, tricky truth, because it's like, we can go to that side of like, well, I'm never going to be perfect. And that's absolutely true. But just keep in mind, like, for every action, there is a consequence, good and bad. And sin definitely does have consequences. Obedience, of course, is going to drive us closer to God. And disobedience is going to drive a wedge. That's how it works. Okay. And so in contemplating, these different temptations and trying to stay away from them, remembering that boundaries are for our good. I remember a while ago, I had actually studied this out already, just reading through the book on my own before I revamped to start with this series, and was really having a lot of like emotional purity struggles. And so it was just kind of like, I felt like something was being withheld from me. Like I really wanted to go for it, and I felt like I was held back and bound by scripture. And I was just reminded that like Satan's oldest trick in the book is to make us think that God's boundaries are to withhold something from us, when actually his boundaries are to protect us and are for our good. And I say that it's the oldest trick in the book because it's exactly what happened with Adam and Eve. God forbid or forebode, I don't know what the past tense word is, one thing, you know, and Satan twisted it to make them think that the boundary that God put in place wasn't for their good and that they were missing out on something. I remembered, like, that's exactly how I was feeling, like I'm missing out on something. And I'm like, man, this is the oldest trick in the book, right? So just keeping in mind that, like, just like growing up and being reared by your parents, and they had boundaries in place and rules for you to follow for your good, not because it made them happy to want to take anything from you, but there are just certain things that it was just not beneficial to indulge in. And that's what we have to remember, that the Bible is like, it's not this rule book to withhold things from us, and God doesn't have these things in place to withhold anything good, but rather to protect us, and honestly a lot of the times from ourselves. And so when we think about impurities, it can fall in a lot of ways: impure living, impure thinking, impure relationships, impure affections. All of these things are a breeding ground for unrighteousness. And the more that you indulge, the more that it hardens your heart, and the more that you become distant from God. And then you kind of spoil the good things, you know, because when you do it the right way, and you abide by God's law, like his blessings are that much sweeter when you can have that closeness with him. And so you kind of risk spoiling a good thing by continuing to indulge over here to the left. It also can, how much time I got? I'll try to wrap up here in a couple minutes. It also can chip away at your confidence with God. So you don't want to be the type of person that can't come boldly before God's throne because you know what you did last night, right? Like, you want Satan to fear the fact that you wake up in the morning when your feet hit the floor. Like, you want him to be like, oh snap, he up, oh snap, she up. You can't do that when you're feeling guilty, you know? And so allowing that to motivate you as well, knowing that there are people in the Bible who can relate. I always think about my OG, Paul, in the Bible. In Romans 7, he talks about just that struggle with sin. Like, I keep doing what I don't want to do, you know? I'm so wretched. So start having some victories. That's what I will leave you with. Get you some accountability. Get some people in your life that will hold you accountable, that you can be open with, that can pray with you, fast with you, put boundaries in place for those things. And I'll just leave this video on an encouraging note with the scripture out of 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. It says, the temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure. So just be reminded and be encouraged by, like, what you're going through. Somebody has gone through it before. Somebody has overcome it before, and God always gives you that way out, okay? Stay tuned, of course, for videos. As always, like, subscribe, share, all of the goodness. I'm looking forward to finishing out the series and have some ideas on what's going to be next. So looking forward to share some of that when the time comes. But until next time, we out. Have a good one, y'all.